The courtroom was silent as Judge William Hargrove leaned back in his chair, a smug smile spreading across his face. His voice, dripping with condescension, echoed through the grand chamber, sending a ripple of amusement through the attorneys seated behind their desks. "Miss Sullivan, are you aware of where you are?" he drawled, fixing his sharp gaze on the teenage girl standing at the defendant's table. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, her messy curls framed a determined face. She shifted slightly, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. "This is a court of law, not some high school debate team," the judge continued, his tone thick with mockery. Laughter rippled across the courtroom. The seasoned lawyers smirked, exchanging knowing glances as if the outcome of this spectacle had already been decided. But the girl, Harper Sullivan, stood firm. Though her cheeks flushed at the ridicule, her eyes never wavered. "Your Honor," she began, her voice even, despite the murmurs of doubt around her. Judge Hargrove lifted a hand, cutting her off. "Save it. This court doesn't have time for juvenile antics. I don't even know why the system allowed this nonsense." He sighed dramatically, as if burdened by the sheer absurdity of her presence. Harper took a deep breath, gripping the stack of legal papers in her hands. They felt heavier than usual, as if the weight of the entire courtroom was pressing down on her. "If you would let me speak, Your Honor," she said firmly, "you might find it worth your time." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. A teenager challenging a judge? It was unheard of. Judge Hargrove's smirk faded into a frown. He leaned forward, his voice tinged with irritation. "Well, by all means," he said, waving a hand. "Enlighten us all." Harper squared her shoulders and began to speak. The moment the first legal precedent left her lips, the mood in the room shifted. She delivered her argument seamlessly, citing constitutional clauses, courtroom procedures, and legal cases with precision. The lawyers who had been laughing minutes earlier suddenly went rigid, their hands flying to their notepads as they began scribbling furiously. Judge Hargrove's expression morphed from amusement to disbelief. He adjusted his glasses, scrutinizing the girl in front of him with newfound interest. "Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice no longer mocking but genuinely curious. Harper took a steadying breath before answering. "I'm Harper Sullivan," she said, her voice unwavering, "and I'm here to defend my client." Chaos erupted. Murmurs turned into loud whispers, people questioning everything they had assumed. The judge banged his gavel. "Order," but even he looked shaken. How could a teenager hold the courtroom captive with such authority? Who had allowed this? The unspoken questions hung in the air. And that was when Harper's confident smile faltered for the first time. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. 2 weeks earlier, Harper sat in her small bedroom, surrounded by stacks of law books and notebooks covered in scribbled notes. These weren't hers. They had belonged to her older brother, Daniel, who had been preparing to take the bar exam. But Daniel wasn't here anymore, and Harper had made it her mission to learn everything he had. Her best friend, Riley, sat cross-legged on the bed, watching her in bewilderment. "Harper, what are you even doing?" she asked, munching on a bag of chips. "You're 16. You're not a lawyer." Harper didn't look up from the case summary she was copying. "I don't care what people think," she muttered. Riley sighed, setting the chips aside. "But why? Why can't you just let this go?" Harper paused, flipping through one of Daniel's old textbooks. The pages were worn from use, the ink smudged in places where he had written notes in the margins. "Finally," she said, "because someone has to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. And Daniel believed I could do it." Riley didn't argue after that. She simply watched as Harper poured herself into studying, preparing for something impossible. What Harper didn't tell her, what she didn't tell anyone, was that her obsession with the law wasn't just about helping others. It was about proving something to herself. After Daniel's death, people had treated her like a fragile child. Teachers, neighbors, even her own parents had tiptoed around her, as if one wrong word might break her. But she wasn't fragile. She wasn't a child. She was smart. She was determined. And she was going to prove everyone wrong. Back in the courtroom, Harper's composure returned. The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Hargrove scrutinized her with a sharp gaze. "Miss Sullivan," he said slowly, "you're telling me you're representing the defendant?" Harper nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And where exactly did you study law?" Harper lifted her chin. I didn't go to law school. If that's what you're asking. She admitted. But I've spent the last year studying legal texts, court procedures, and every case related to this matter. I believe I'm qualified to represent my client. Judge Hargrove let out a humorless chuckle. You believe you're qualified? He leaned forward. That's not how this works. Harper didn't flinch. Then let me prove it. The courtroom was dead silent. Everyone waited to see what the judge would do next. Judge Hargrove opened his mouth to respond. But before he could, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A tall man in a crisp navy suit strode in, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. Your Honor, the man said, his deep voice cutting through the tension. I believe I can shed some light on this situation. Harper turned to look at him, her confident expression slipping into one of uncertainty. Who was this man, and what did he want? Harper's heart pounded as the tall man in the navy suit strode confidently toward the bench. The courtroom murmurs grew louder, whispers rippling through the gallery like a rising tide. Even Judge Hargrove, who had seemed so confident in dismissing her, looked momentarily unsettled. Excuse me, sir, the judge said, regaining his composure. Who are you, and what business do you have interrupting my courtroom? The man stopped just before the judge's bench and gave a respectful nod. My apologies, Your Honor, he said, his tone professional but firm. My name is Michael Lawson, and I'm here as a representative of the Bar Association. A new wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Harper felt her stomach tighten. The Bar Association? That wasn't a good sign. Judge Hargrove frowned. And what interest does the Bar Association have in this case? Michael Lawson opened his briefcase, pulling out a thick folder. He flipped through a few pages before responding. It's not the case itself, Your Honor. It's the matter of representation. He cast a brief glance at Harper before continuing. We received an anonymous tip about an unlicensed individual attempting to represent a client in court. Naturally, this is a matter we take very seriously. Harper's fingers tightened around the papers in her hands. She had known this moment would come, she just hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Judge Hargrove leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. Well, Mr. Lawson, I'm sure you can see why this is highly irregular. As I was just saying, Miss Sullivan has no formal legal training. Her presence here is questionable at best. Before Mr. Lawson could respond, Harper stepped forward. Your Honor, I understand that this is unconventional, she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. But I have studied the law thoroughly. And I've prepared for this case as any lawyer would. My client deserves a fair defense. Judge Hargrove let out a chuckle. This is a court of law, Miss Sullivan, not a stage for theatrics. Do you even realize the seriousness of what you're attempting? I do, Harper said quickly, her voice unwavering. And I also realize that my client's life could be ruined if they don't have someone fighting for them. A murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. Even some of the attorneys who had initially laughed at her were beginning to look at her with a hint of respect. Judge Hargrove's smirk faded slightly. He glanced at Michael Lawson, who remained neutral. Mr. Lawson cleared his throat. Your Honor, while I agree that the situation is unusual, I believe it's only fair to hear Miss Sullivan out. After all, the law is meant to ensure justice, not suppress it. The judge's frown deepened. He looked from Mr. Lawson to Harper and back again, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he let out a long sigh and leaned forward. Fine, he said, Miss Sullivan, I'll allow you to continue, temporarily. But if I find that you are wasting this court's time, I will hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear? Harper nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Relief flooded her veins, but she knew this was only the first battle. She took a deep breath and prepared to continue her argument. But before she could speak, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open again. This time, it wasn't a lawyer who entered. It was a young boy, no older than 10. Harper, the boy called out, his voice breaking the tense silence. Harper turned, her eyes widening in shock. Elliot, she whispered. The boy ran toward her, clutching a crumpled envelope in his small hands. You forgot this, he said, thrusting it at her. Harper stared at the envelope, her heart sinking. She recognized it immediately. It was something she had never intended to reveal. Not here, not now, but with the entire courtroom watching. She had no choice. Her hands shook as she took it from Elliot, the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing down on her. Miss Sullivan, Judge Hargrove said sharply, What's in that envelope? Harper hesitated, her mind racing. The envelope contained something deeply personal, something she had kept hidden even from Riley. Judge Hargrove's eyes narrowed. Miss Sullivan, I won't ask again. Open the envelope. Harper's fingers trembled as she tore open the top and pulled out its contents. Inside was a letter, handwritten in neat, meticulous script, her brother Daniel's handwriting. Harper's throat tightened as she unfolded it. The letter was a plea. Daniel's final message to her before he was taken to prison. It was filled with encouragement, hope, and a challenge. Stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, no matter how impossible it seems. Her hands shook as she held the letter. The courtroom was silent. Judge Hargrove studied her closely. What is it, Miss Sullivan? He asked, his voice softer now. Harper hesitated for a moment, then folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope. It's personal, she said firmly, meeting the judge's gaze, and it has nothing to do with this case. For a moment, Judge Hargrove said nothing. The room was still, the air heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. Fine, he said, but understand this, Miss Sullivan, this is your last chance. Any further disruptions, and I will have no choice but to remove you from this courtroom. Harper nodded. Understood, Your Honor. She turned to Elliot, forcing a small smile. Thank you, she whispered, ruffling his hair. You can go sit with Riley now. The boy nodded and scampered off to the back of the courtroom, where Riley sat watching anxiously. Harper turned back to face the judge, ready to continue her argument. But before she could speak, the doors to the courtroom burst open again. This time, it wasn't a child. It wasn't a lawyer. It was a tall, stern-looking woman in a dark blazer, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. She carried herself with authority, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she strode forward. Your Honor, the woman said, her voice slicing through the silence like a knife. Judge Hargrove looked exasperated. And who are you? The woman's expression remained unreadable. My name is Vanessa Calloway, she said, standing tall. I'm with the district attorney's office. Harper's stomach dropped. Calloway turned her gaze directly to her. And I'm here, she said, her voice cold and unwavering, to put an end to this farce once and for all. Harper's breath caught in her throat as Vanessa Calloway, the representative from the district attorney's office, stepped forward with a confidence that made the air in the courtroom feel heavier. Judge Hargrove sat up straighter, clearly intrigued. Miss Calloway, this is highly irregular, he said, his voice laced with annoyance. What exactly is your business here? Vanessa Calloway didn't even glance at the judge. Her sharp, calculated eyes remained locked onto Harper. Your Honor, I'm here because this court is allowing an unlicensed, unqualified individual to act as legal counsel, she said, her tone crisp. This is not just a procedural issue, it's an ethical and legal one. If you allow this to continue, you risk setting a dangerous precedent. Harper felt her fingers tighten into a fist at her side. This wasn't just about embarrassing her. Calloway was here to make sure she never got another chance to fight for justice. Judge Hargrove folded his hands together, nodding slightly. I must admit, I had similar concerns, Miss Calloway, he mused. I agreed to allow Miss Sullivan to present her case, temporarily. However, given that you've taken an interest in this matter, I assume you have more to add? Calloway turned slightly, addressing the court. Yes, Your Honor. The legal system is not a game, she continued. We do not allow individuals to simply study the law and walk into a courtroom as attorneys. If Miss Sullivan is permitted to continue, then we are saying that law school, the bar exam, and years of professional training mean nothing. Some of the attorneys in the gallery nodded in agreement. Harper's stomach churned, but she refused to back down. She took a step forward. With all due respect, Miss Calloway, she said, keeping her voice steady, the law is not about degrees and titles, it's about justice. And my client is entitled to a defense. Calloway arched an eyebrow. And you believe you can provide that defense? Yes, Harper answered without hesitation. The DA smirked. You don't have the credentials. You don't have the experience. What exactly do you think qualifies you? Harper took a deep breath, willing her voice to remain strong. I have spent a year studying legal texts, court procedures, and every case relevant to my client's situation. I have prepared arguments, examined evidence, and analyzed every aspect of this case. That is more than I can say for the overworked and underpaid public defender who would have taken this case otherwise." A few people murmured in the gallery, their reactions mixed between surprise and amusement. Judge Hargrove sighed. "Miss Sullivan, while I admire your confidence, the reality is that we have procedures. You can't just walk in here and claim you're qualified. Then let me prove it," Harper interjected. Silence settled over the courtroom. Vanessa Calloway studied her, something unreadable flashing in her dark eyes. "Prove it?" she echoed, tilting her head slightly. Harper nodded. "I challenge the prosecution to allow me to continue presenting my case. If I fail to provide a competent and well-reasoned defense, then I will step aside immediately." No objections. The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Hargrove rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "That's quite a bold proposal." Calloway's lips curled into a smirk. "And if I agree, what happens when you embarrass yourself and your client?" Harper met her gaze evenly. "Then I'll accept the consequences." The challenge hung in the air. Calloway turned back to Judge Hargrove. "Your Honor, if the court allows this experiment to continue, then I will personally see to it that it is done properly." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" Calloway folded her arms. "I will present my full case, as I would against any defense attorney. I will not hold back." She turned back to Harper. "And I promise you, Miss Sullivan, you won't last past my first witness." A small flicker of doubt crept into Harper's mind, but she pushed it away. She had come too far to back down now. Judge Hargrove sighed, rubbing his temples. "I can't believe I'm saying this," he muttered, before lifting his gaze back to Calloway. "Miss Calloway, if you're willing to proceed under these conditions, then so be it." Calloway's smirk deepened. "Gladly." Harper swallowed the lump in her throat. This was going to be the toughest battle of her life. Judge Hargrove turned to her. "Miss Sullivan, you're officially on thin ice. If you make one misstep, this court will not hesitate to shut you down. Understood?" Harper nodded. "Understood, Your Honor." The judge gestured toward Calloway. "Then let's proceed. Miss Calloway, you may call your first witness." The courtroom shifted as Calloway turned toward the back. "The prosecution calls Victor Langley to the stand." Harper's heart stopped. Victor Langley. The name echoed in her mind like a warning siren. The man who had accused her brother, Daniel. Harper's blood ran cold as Victor Langley entered the courtroom, a smirk playing on his lips as he walked toward the witness stand. This wasn't just about her client anymore. This was personal. Harper's breath hitched as Victor Langley strode toward the witness stand, his presence commanding attention. He was dressed in a navy blue suit, his hair perfectly combed, and his smirk radiated the kind of confidence that came with power. The moment their eyes met, a chill ran down Harper's spine. This man wasn't just a prosecution witness. He was the very person who had destroyed her brother's life. She clenched her fists beneath the table, forcing herself to remain composed. This wasn't about her past. This was about her client. Victor Langley settled into the witness chair, raising his right hand to be sworn in. After repeating the oath, he turned his gaze toward Calloway, his smirk never wavering. "Miss Calloway," Judge Hargrove said with an air of mild impatience. "Proceed." Calloway stepped forward, her movements calculated. "Mr. Langley," she began smoothly, "could you state your occupation for the record?" Victor adjusted his tie. "I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Crestwood Enterprises." Harper's stomach twisted. Crestwood Enterprises was the very company that had accused her client, Mark Peterson, of embezzlement. Calloway nodded. "And how long have you held this position?" 10 years. "And in those 10 years, have you ever encountered financial misconduct within the company?" Victor sighed dramatically. "Unfortunately, yes." He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom before settling on Harper. "Most recently, with Mr. Peterson." The courtroom stirred, murmurs rising. Harper bit the inside of her cheek. Calloway clasped her hands behind her back. "Can you tell the court how you discovered the alleged embezzlement?" Victor nodded solemnly. "A few months ago, I noticed irregularities in our financial records. Large sums of money were being redirected into unapproved accounts. When I looked into it further, I found that the accounts were connected to Mr. Peterson's login credentials." Calloway took a step closer. "So, you're saying that the digital records show that Mr. Peterson moved company funds to his own accounts?" "Yes," Victor answered smoothly. It was undeniable. Harper's heartbeat pounded in her ears. This was the testimony she had been dreading. Victor Langley wasn't just a witness, he was the key to the prosecution's entire case. Calloway turned toward the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Hargrove nodded. "Miss Sullivan, your witness." Harper inhaled sharply, pushing down the nervous energy threatening to consume her. She rose from her seat, gripping the edges of her legal pad like it was a lifeline. This was it, her first cross-examination, and it was against the man she hated most. She stepped forward, stopping just a few feet from the witness stand. Victor watched her with thinly veiled amusement, as if she were an entertaining inconvenience rather than a legitimate opponent. That only made her more determined. "Mr. Langley," she began, keeping her tone even, "you claim that Mr. Peterson was the only one with access to these accounts. Is that correct?" "Yes," Victor answered confidently. Harper tilted her head slightly. "And how many employees at Crestwood Enterprises have login credentials to access financial records?" Victor's smirk didn't fade. "Several, but only department heads have access to the accounts in question." Harper nodded, pacing slightly in front of the stand. "And yet, isn't it true that department heads don't always operate alone? That their assistants or IT personnel often handle logins on their behalf?" Victor's lips twitched, his smirk faltering ever so slightly. "Well, yes, but that doesn't change the fact that the unauthorized transfers were linked to Mr. Peterson's credentials." Harper tapped her chin thoughtfully. "Tell me, Mr. Langley, do you personally review every transaction that goes through your company's system?" Victor chuckled under his breath. "Of course not, that would be impossible. I delegate those tasks to my accounting team." Harper's stomach twisted in satisfaction. There it was. She turned to the jury. "So, what you're saying is, you didn't actually see Mr. Peterson make these transfers?" Victor's smirk returned, but this time, it was tighter. "I saw the records." "Yes," Harper said, her voice growing sharper. "But did you see him do it?" Silence. Victor's jaw clenched. Calloway shifted slightly, her arms still folded, her expression unreadable. Harper let the silence linger before continuing. "Mr. Langley, were you aware that several employees at Crestwood have filed complaints against you?" The courtroom erupted in whispers. Victor's face darkened. "Objection," Calloway snapped. "Irrelevant." Harper turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this speaks directly to Mr. Langley's credibility as a witness." Judge Hargrove sighed. "I'll allow it, but tread carefully. Miss Sullivan." Harper turned back to Victor, watching his jaw tighten. "So, were you aware?" Victor straightened in his seat, his eyes hard. "I have no idea what you're referring to." Harper walked to her table, picking up a file and flipping it open. "Then let me refresh your memory." She held up a printed document. "Over the past 3 years, there have been 6 formal complaints against you, all from employees accusing you of unethical business practices, including tampering with financial reports." Calloway tensed. Victor's smirk was completely gone now. Harper continued, flipping through the pages. "These complaints mysteriously never resulted in any disciplinary action. Any idea why that is, Mr. Langley?" Victor's fingers curled around the armrests of the witness chair. "Those complaints were baseless." Harper arched an eyebrow. "And yet, they all follow the same pattern. Employees questioning financial records, employees suddenly being let go or transferred. And now, Mr. Peterson, who was conveniently accused of the very thing multiple employees have suspected you of doing." Calloway stepped forward. "Objection. This is nothing but speculation." Harper met the judge's gaze. "Your Honor, if Mr. Langley's credibility is in question, then how can we trust his testimony?" Judge Hargrove exhaled slowly, glancing between Harper and Calloway. Finally, he nodded. "I'll allow this line of questioning, for now." Harper turned back to Victor. "One last question, Mr. Langley." She let the silence stretch just long enough for the tension to build. "If Mr. Peterson was the only one who could have moved the money, why were there logins under his credentials when he wasn't in the office?" Victor's eyes darkened. Harper pulled out another sheet of paper. "According to company logs, there were transactions under Mr. Peterson's account on 3 separate dates when he was on leave. So, unless he magically accessed his work computer from another state, that means someone else had access to his login." Victor Langley's fingers twitched. Harper turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, this calls for further investigation." I move that the digital records be reviewed for unauthorized access. Because if Mr. Peterson wasn't the one moving the money, then someone else was. And Mr. Langley just proved that himself. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Judge Hargrove banged his gavel. Order. Calloway's expression had gone from smug to furious. Victor Langley looked as if he had swallowed glass. Harper exhaled, her hands steady at her sides. She had just cracked the case wide open. But as she locked eyes with Calloway, she knew one thing for certain. The real battle was just beginning. The murmurs in the courtroom refused to settle. Judge Hargrove's gavel slammed against his desk, demanding order. But the shockwaves from Harper's revelation still rippled through the audience. Victor Langley, the man who had confidently claimed that Mark Peterson was the only one who could have moved the money, now sat stiffly in the witness stand, his jaw clenched. Harper could see it, the slight twitch of his fingers, the tightening of his lips. She had rattled him. Vanessa Calloway, however, was far from defeated. She stepped forward, her posture still rigid with authority. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "Miss Sullivan is making a dangerous assumption based on nothing more than circumstantial evidence. She has presented no proof that someone else used Mr. Peterson's credentials. Nor has she provided a plausible alternative suspect." Harper held back a smirk. Calloway was trying to regain control. But she had already cracked the foundation of the prosecution's case. Judge Hargrove tapped his fingers against the desk before turning his gaze toward Harper. "Miss Sullivan, while I'm inclined to allow further review of the records, you do realize that suspicions alone will not win your case?" Harper nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge sighed and turned toward Calloway. "Miss Calloway, does the prosecution have anything further to add?" Calloway pressed her lips together before turning toward Victor Langley. "No further questions, Your Honor." Langley's gaze flicked toward her, but he quickly masked any emotion. Judge Hargrove leaned back in his chair. "Very well, Mr. Langley, you may step down." Victor rose from the witness stand, smoothing the front of his suit before walking briskly back to his seat. Harper watched him carefully. He was angry, not the kind of anger that exploded immediately, but the kind that simmered, waiting for the right moment to strike. He would not let this go. Judge Hargrove rubbed his temples before addressing the court. "We will reconvene after a short recess. This court is adjourned for 30 minutes. The gavel struck the desk, and the tension in the room finally cracked as people stood from their seats, whispering fervently among themselves. Harper exhaled and turned toward Mark Peterson, who sat beside her with wide, uncertain eyes. "Are we winning?" he asked in a hushed tone. Harper gave him a small, reassuring smile. "We just bought ourselves a real chance. But we're not done yet." Riley appeared at her side, gripping the back of the wooden bench. "Harper, that was insane. I thought Calloway was going to throw something at you." Harper chuckled, shaking her head. "She's too controlled for that. But I definitely got under her skin." Riley glanced toward Victor Langley, who was speaking in low, tense whispers with Calloway. "What's their next move?" Harper tapped her fingers against the table. "They'll either try to discredit me further or rush the trial to a conviction before I can dig any deeper." She pursed her lips. "Which means I need proof before they shut me down." Riley hesitated before speaking again. "Then you need to talk to Henry Willis." Harper's breath caught. Henry Willis, a former Crestwood employee, someone who had worked closely under Victor Langley before suddenly resigning under suspicious circumstances. "Do you really think he'll talk?" Harper asked. Riley nodded. "He left that company for a reason. And if there's one person who might know what Langley was up to, it's him." Harper glanced at the time. 30 minutes wasn't much, but it might be enough. She grabbed her phone and dialed a number she had saved weeks ago. The line rang, and rang, just as she was about to give up. A voice answered. "Who is this?" Harper straightened. "Mr. Willis, my name is Harper Sullivan." "No," he cut in, his voice tense. "I don't want any part of this." "Wait," Harper said quickly, stepping into a quieter corner of the courtroom. "I know you used to work for Crestwood Enterprises. And I know you left under suspicious circumstances. I think you know why." There was a heavy silence. "Langley will ruin me if I talk," Willis said at last. Harper took a deep breath. "He's already ruining people's lives. And if you don't speak up, he's going to do it again." A beat of silence. Then, A quiet curse. Meet me in the alley behind Pine Street Cafe in 20 minutes. Willis muttered. And come alone. The line went dead. Harper didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat, turned to Riley, and said, "Cover for me. If the judge asks, tell him I needed a moment to collect myself." Riley's eyes widened. "You're sneaking out?" Harper shot her a grin. Wouldn't be the first time. She slipped out of the courthouse, heart pounding, and headed toward Pine Street Cafe. The alley was dimly lit, the scent of coffee and city streets mingling in the air. A lone figure stood near the dumpster, hands shoved into his pockets. Henry Willis. Harper approached carefully. "Mr. Willis?" He turned, his face tight with worry. "This is a mistake," he muttered. "I shouldn't be here." Harper softened her voice. "Please, just tell me what you know." Willis hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "Langley has been cooking the books for years," he admitted. "He funnels money through fake accounts and pins the blame on whoever is most convenient." Harper's pulse quickened. "Like Mark Peterson." Willis nodded. "Peterson is just the latest scapegoat. Langley did this before, to others. When I figured it out, I confronted him. The next week, I was forced to resign." Harper's hands trembled as she pieced it together. "Do you have proof?" Willis looked around, checking the alley before pulling a USB drive from his coat pocket. "This is a copy of the internal financial records. If you can get the court to review it, it'll prove that Langley was behind the entire thing." Harper took the drive carefully, as if it were made of glass. "Thank you." Willis grabbed her wrist before she could leave. His expression was serious. "Be careful, Sullivan. Langley doesn't lose." Harper rushed back into the courtroom just as recess was ending. Riley shot her a frantic look but said nothing as she slipped into her seat. Judge Hargrove entered, banging his gavel. "Court is back in session." Calloway immediately stood. "Your Honor, the prosecution is prepared to move forward with closing arguments." Harper jumped to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense has new evidence that requires immediate review." Calloway's head snapped toward her, eyes flashing with irritation. "This is absurd." Judge Hargrove sighed. "Miss Sullivan, what evidence?" Harper stepped forward, holding up the USB drive. "These are internal financial records," she said. "They prove that Victor Langley has been tampering with company funds and falsely implicating innocent employees." Calloway's eyes darkened. Victor Langley, sitting behind her, went pale. Judge Hargrove leaned forward. "Is this verified?" Harper met his gaze without hesitation. "If you allow a forensic analyst to examine it, I guarantee you'll find the truth." The courtroom exploded into whispers. Victor Langley's face twisted into something unreadable. And Harper knew. She had just changed the game. The courtroom buzzed with hushed conversations, the weight of Harper's bold move pressing down on everyone. Judge Hargrove tapped his gavel twice, his patience clearly thinning. "Miss Sullivan, you're telling me that this USB drive contains evidence that contradicts Mr. Langley's testimony in the prosecution's case?" "Yes, Your Honor," Harper said, her voice steady. "I request that the court allow a forensic analysis of the files. If the records match what I believe they will, it will prove that Mr. Peterson was framed." Vanessa Calloway rose to her feet, her face a mask of irritation. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a desperate attempt to stall the inevitable. We have no way of verifying where this so-called evidence came from." Harper didn't flinch. If the prosecution is so confident in their case, then they shouldn't have anything to fear from a simple review. Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. Judge Hargrove exhaled through his nose, clearly weighing the situation. Finally, he turned to the court bailiff. "Take the drive and have our IT specialist analyze the files immediately. This court will reconvene once we have the results." A ripple of shock spread across the courtroom. Harper had won a temporary victory, but the real battle was still ahead. As the bailiff left the room, Judge Hargrove sighed and banged his gavel. "Court is in recess until further notice." Harper barely had time to sit down before Riley rushed over, gripping the table. "What the hell was that?" she hissed, eyes wide with adrenaline. "Did you just drop a nuclear bomb in the middle of a courtroom?" Harper let out a shaky breath. "We needed something big, didn't we?" Riley's grin was somewhere between admiration and disbelief. "You're either brilliant or completely insane." "Probably both." Mark Peterson, Harper's client, leaned in. "Do you think it'll be enough?" His voice was tight with anxiety. "I mean, what if What if the files don't show anything? Harper met his gaze. They will. She had to believe that. Across the room, Vanessa Calloway and Victor Langley were locked in a heated conversation. Langley's usual smug expression was gone, replaced with something much colder. Calloway, ever the professional, kept her face neutral, but Harper could tell she was rattled. Good. Harper stepped out into the hallway, needing a moment to breathe. The courthouse was quieter now, the energy of the day simmering just beneath the surface. She barely had time to register the approaching figure before a sharp voice reached her ears. "You don't know what you're playing with, Sullivan." Harper turned to find Victor Langley standing just a few feet away. Unlike his polished performance in court, there was nothing composed about him now. His jaw was clenched, and his normally cool demeanor had cracked just enough for her to see the anger beneath. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice low and dangerous. Harper refused to back down. "No, Mr. Langley, you made the mistake when you framed my client." Langley's eyes darkened. "You think you're smart? You're just a kid pretending to be a lawyer. People like you don't win." Harper's pulse quickened, but she held his gaze. "Maybe not," she admitted, "but I don't need to win. I just need the truth to come out." Langley took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Drop this. Now, walk away while you still can." Harper forced a smirk. "Or what? You'll fabricate some more evidence? Maybe bribe a few more people?" His expression barely flickered. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Harper turned to see Michael Lawson, the Bar Association representative, approaching with careful, measured steps. His eyes locked onto Langley. "Unreadable. Unless you want to explain why you're intimidating the defense in a public courthouse, I suggest you step away." Langley hesitated for half a second before forcing a fake smile. "Just offering some friendly advice." Michael didn't blink. It didn't sound friendly. Langley scoffed, adjusting his tie. "You'll regret this," he muttered before striding away. Harper exhaled slowly. Michael glanced at her. "Are you okay?" Harper nodded. "Yeah." Then, after a pause, she added, "Thanks." Michael studied her for a moment before nodding. "Be careful, Sullivan. He's not the type to go down quietly." She already knew that. An hour later, the courtroom was full again. The IT specialist, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a professional air, stood at the witness stand, holding a printed report. Judge Hargrove tapped his gavel. "We are back in session. Miss Douglas, you were given the task of analyzing the digital records submitted by the defense. What did you find?" The specialist cleared her throat. "Your Honor, the records on this USB drive contain detailed financial transactions, including a separate set of logs that contradict the company's official records." Harper's heart pounded. Miss Douglas continued, "Upon further review, I found evidence that the original financial documents had been altered to frame Mr. Peterson. The real transactions show that the money was being diverted by an account linked to." She turned the page in her report. Victor Langley. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Calloway shot to her feet. "Objection. There is no way to verify." Miss Douglas lifted another paper. The files contained time-stamped edits and authorization signatures. "I was able to confirm that the tampering originated from Mr. Langley's system login." Harper saw it. Langley's face drained of color. Judge Hargrove turned toward Calloway, irritation flickering across his features. "Miss Calloway, care to explain why your star witness was committing fraud?" Calloway opened her mouth, then closed it. Her face remained unreadable, but Harper knew she was scrambling for damage control. Hargrove exhaled. "Miss Sullivan, do you have anything to add?" Harper stood. "Only that this court has the responsibility to ensure that an innocent man is not convicted because of falsified evidence." The judge nodded slowly. He turned toward Calloway. "Miss Calloway, do you intend to proceed with your case?" For the first time since this trial started, Calloway hesitated. Then, with clear reluctance, she straightened. "The prosecution formally withdraws the charges against Mark Peterson." Gasps echoed through the room. Mark Peterson, sitting beside Harper, let out a choked sound, part relief, part disbelief. Judge Hargrove banged his gavel. "Mr. Peterson, you are free to go." The tension broke. Applause rang out, murmurs of shock and celebration filling the air. Harper barely had time to register the victory before Mark grabbed her hands. His eyes were glassy with emotion. You saved my life. Harper squeezed his hands back. You were innocent. That's all that mattered. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Vanessa Calloway gathered her files. Her face unreadable. Harper approached her. You knew, didn't you? She asked quietly. Calloway didn't deny it. Instead, she let out a slow breath. I suspected, she admitted, but in this system, suspicions mean nothing without proof. Harper frowned. And now? Calloway's eyes flicked toward Victor Langley, who was currently being escorted away by 2 court officers. Now, she said, voice softer than before, we go after the people who really built this system. For the first time, Harper saw something in Calloway's gaze that wasn't just cold calculation. It was determination. As Harper stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, Riley and Mark by her side, she let herself breathe. This battle was over. But the war? It was just beginning. The bright afternoon sun kissed Harper's face as she stepped out of the courthouse. The cool autumn air filling her lungs. The weight of the case, the months of research, the late nights, the impossible odds, had finally lifted. Mark Peterson was a free man. But Harper knew this was far from over. Victor Langley had been exposed. His carefully constructed lies crumbling under the weight of the evidence. He had been arrested on charges of fraud, evidence tampering, and perjury. And yet, as Harper watched him being led away in handcuffs, she felt no satisfaction, because she knew men like Langley didn't act alone. There were others, higher up, more powerful, and they weren't going to let this slide. Riley walked beside her, stuffing her hands in her jacket pockets. I know that look, she muttered. You just won the biggest case of your life. And you're already thinking about what's next. Harper exhaled sharply, because this wasn't just Langley. She admitted, he was part of something bigger. If we don't dig deeper, this kind of corruption will just keep happening. Riley sighed. I figured as much. Then she smirked. Well, I hope you don't expect me to let you do this alone. Harper grinned. I wouldn't dream of it. Over the next few weeks, Harper, Riley, and Michael Lawson worked together to trace the web of financial fraud, corporate corruption, and judicial manipulation that Langley had been a part of. The deeper they dug, the uglier it got. Crestwood Enterprises wasn't just covering up minor embezzlement. It was involved in systemic financial crimes, fraud, insider trading, and laundering dirty money for powerful figures in the business world. But what made Harper's blood run cold was how far this conspiracy reached. Langley had been a pawn in a much bigger game, and Harper had just kicked over the board. One evening, as Harper walked home from her temporary apartment, she felt it. Someone was watching her. Her pulse quickened as she reached her door, her hand hovering over the knob. The street behind her was too quiet. Then, she saw it. A sleek black car, parked just across the street. No lights on, no movement. Her stomach twisted. She forced herself to remain calm, pushing open her door and stepping inside. But as soon as she locked it behind her, her phone buzzed. She hesitated, then answered. A distorted voice crackled through the line. You've made some powerful enemies, Sullivan. Harper swallowed, gripping the phone tighter. And you sound like someone who's scared of the truth. A low chuckle. Walk away. You got your little win. Don't get greedy. Otherwise, you might end up like your brother. Harper's blood turned to ice. Who are you? She demanded. The line went dead. She stood there for a long moment, her breath coming in sharp bursts. They knew about Daniel, which meant she was closer than she thought. Determined more than ever, Harper and her team pushed harder. They worked late nights, combing through documents, connecting the missing pieces. Finally, they found it. A set of financial records, buried deep within Crestwood's archives, traced directly to Judge Hargrove, the same judge who had been so quick to dismiss Harper, the same judge who had let Calloway challenge her. He was involved, and now, Harper had the proof. Harper knew they couldn't trust the system to police itself. So, she went to the press. Sarah Green, the investigative journalist who had exposed Langley's fraud, published the new findings. Judge Hargrove's involvement, the illegal dealings of Crestwood Enterprises, the threats Harper had received. It was all out there for the world to see. The Department of Justice launched an investigation. The FBI raided Crestwood's headquarters. One by one, the dominoes fell. With Hargrove under federal scrutiny, Harper took the final step. She filed a motion to reopen Daniel's case. It had taken years, but now, with the truth about Langley, Crestwood, and the corrupted system that had convicted him, Daniel finally had a shot at justice. The hearing lasted only 2 days. And when the judge spoke the words Harper had been waiting for her entire life, she felt her knees nearly buckle. The conviction of Daniel Sullivan is hereby vacated. Tears burned in her eyes as she turned to see Daniel, now free, stepping toward her. He pulled her into a tight embrace. "You did it, Harp." She let out a choked laugh. "We did it." Months passed. With Crestwood's leadership dismantled, the city's legal system faced a reckoning. Calloway, despite her initial role against Harper, helped prosecute the corrupt officials, earning her redemption. Victor Langley? He took a plea deal. Less prison time in exchange for exposing the real power players behind the operation. But Harper didn't care about him anymore, because she had her brother back. And she had found her purpose. Harper stood in a courtroom once again. But this time, she wasn't a teenager fighting for recognition. She wasn't a kid people underestimated. She was Harper Sullivan, attorney at law. Across from her, the prosecution prepared their opening statement. Her first official case. She felt Riley's presence in the back of the room, her support unwavering. She glanced at the judge, not a corrupt one this time. And finally, she turned to her client, a young mother falsely accused of fraud. Harper smiled. She was ready. She stood up, straightened her blazer, and faced the court. "Your Honor, I am here to defend someone who deserves the truth. And I intend to deliver it."